We'll just, hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes and then we'll just get started. Thank you so much for joining. Good afternoon to you all if you're here on the East Coast. Otherwise, good afternoon anyway. All right. Hey, Chris, Griff, are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Let's go. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the webinar. What we're going to do today is to kick off a webinar series that will run once a month over the next several months. And the topics that we will be covering generally relate to the problem, the opportunity for businesses to better manage cash. The premise is a pretty simple one. Cash is, of course, the lifeblood of the enterprise, and managing it is often a task that is ad hoc and not necessarily always well structured. There are many facets to cash management, managing accounts receivable to shorten your DSOs, to get more working capital on your books. Conversely, managing accounts payable to lengthen DPOs and so forth. There's much more to cover on this topic, but today what I wanted to do was to introduce a couple of people and banter on one of the elements of cash management, which is to automate accounts receivable. There are many components to the outcomes of better managing accounts receivable, but the premise is one of the principal reasons anybody wants to automate accounts receivable is so that you can, collect more cash faster. And that's the basics of what we're trying to cover. And I have a couple of people here who are experts on this, and I wanted to introduce them. First of all, I'd like to introduce Chris Sands. Hey, Chris, how are you doing?
I'm wonderful. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Yeah, what have you been up to? We worked together, right? Just full disclosure, right? You and I were colleagues when I was Mineral Tree, and then you absconded and went off to do something else.
This is right. So we first met, I guess, 5 years ago now almost, which is hard to believe. When I came to Mineral Tree to be the CFO was, Mineral Tree is an AP automation business. And so, as the CFO of that business, spent a lot of time evangelizing about the benefits of digitizing various aspects of the finance function, which I feel passionately about, just given the nature of my role, but also becoming kind of an expert on some of this, given what Mineral Tree did. And so was CFO there for about 3.5 years until late 2021, when we sold the business. I currently am CFO of a business called IntelliCare, which is a marketplace serving healthcare labor. So you can think of it as an app that supports gig and contingent work in healthcare. And so the flashy way to say it is Uber for nurses. So our application goes to healthcare providers and facilities. They put their non-permanent work needs in there, and then nurses pick them up on their phones. And so, you don't have to be a healthcare expert or in that space to appreciate that. As a nation, we're facing a major nurse shorting crisis. And so, we're trying to do our part to bring together those who provide care and those who are in need of care. And so have been here for a little over a year. The finance responsibilities kind of remain the same regardless of the business that you're at. And so I actually, on this particular topic, we have a tough cash cycle around our revenue, which I'll elaborate on a little bit more. And so gets to the importance of some of the benefits you can get from automating. So, I've been.
You and I have talked a little bit about that.
But yes.
Sorry, you and I have talked about a little bit about that, and I know that you want to, share a little bit more insight into what that really means from a collections and receivable standpoint. So hopefully we can get into that as well. Also want to introduce another colleague of mine, Griff. Hey, Griff, say hello to the team and the gang.
Yeah, happy to be here. Hope everyone's having a good day, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about Santeem, and like you mentioned, the receivables and cash flow management space in general.
And and my name is BC Krishna. I'm the founder and CEO of Santeem. As Chris said, prior to starting Santeem, which is now 3+ years old, I spent 8 years starting and running Mineral Tree, which is an accounts payable automation company. Learned a lot from that experience and lived to fight another day and hopefully build something that is the next generation from there. I think one of the things that I wanted to do, you teed this up, Chris, is that the industry is full of talk about like digital transformation, and particularly in the finance function. The digital transformation sort of seems to touch, and the code word sometimes people use is automation, which is appropriate, but at some level it's not necessarily about automation, but it's about the digitization of functions that tend to be more manual and paper-based. Historically, for example, if you look at some of the processes around AP, AR, cash forecasting, and so forth, they've been mostly kind of manual and ad hoc processes. But in the last several years, of course, what we've seen, perhaps spurred on by the pandemic, more businesses seemingly bringing more digitization, to the finance back office. There are some obvious benefits in so doing. Maybe it's not obvious to everybody, but generally speaking, a rule of thumb is that it's a good idea to digitize and automate. But one of the things that we are here to talk about here is the general nature of accounts receivable, and why and how automation can really help. And we're going to try to discuss it through a couple of different lenses. Number one is I want to share with you basic data from recent studies, that highlights the size and nature of the problem. Second is that I want to have Chris take a few minutes, to share with us his experiences at his current company, and how something as simple as collecting on time can actually have a pretty significant impact to the very core and the very nature of the business. That's the second thing I want to cover. Third is I'd like to just really get into a little bit of a specific numbers-driven case study about a business that automated a very specific aspect of the collections process. Collections or accounts receivable is a very end-to-end, it consists of several processes, of course, but the specific nature of collections, I think several of you may agree, and I don't know if you do, Chris, is that, it tends to be the most valuable part of things, mostly because you have the least amount of control over it. I don't know what you think about that, right? I mean, you can send an invoice out. Yeah, I control that. I can provide people with a statement, fine, and a portal to pay, but how do you kind of squeeze the cash out of your customer at the right time?
Yes, no, I agree wholeheartedly.
So these two data points are indicative of that. There's a QuickBooks Intuit study that was commissioned, recently, and I'm drawing from it. It's a pretty remarkable number, right? It's the average company gets is owed about $300,000 in late payments. I mean, that's $300,000 of cash and working capital that you don't have on your balance sheet. And these are not, tiny companies. These are not gigantic companies. These are companies often with the least leverage with their customers, right? 25 to 500 employees. There's another survey that I'd like to highlight, which is a company called @Radius, which did a recent sort of payment practices barometer survey that basically reports that 50% of invoices are basically late, in US-based invoice-based credit sales. That's a big number. 50% of all payments are late, right? I mean, that's remarkable. And I think the same survey, and I don't want to spend too much time on it anymore, but the same survey also suggests that the sentiment among these people that are being surveyed is that people are generally paying even later. The trend towards paying on time is not favorable. And there are many reasons why that is the case. It may be cash related. It may be because you have more leverage. It may be because you're worried about like a recession. It may be any number of things. But the fact of the matter is the person who's presented the invoice is the one that's suffering, but you can do something about it, is the point. So let me just start by, making another point here, Chris, and I want you to get your perspective. It's sort of a, what this chart shows you, this flow chart shows you is a very simplified version of what an accounts receivable process is, of course, right? It's, you set your payment terms, you present your invoice, you collect payments, and you post cash. Agree, disagree? I mean, does this make sense?
I agree.
Simple stuff. At some level, you might say this is pretty straightforward, right? And there are, certainly we can talk about the inefficiencies in each of these steps, right? How effectively can you manage relationships? How effectively can you present an invoice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I would make the point to you that this process is really a means to an end. And the end, of course, is, your cash. And I want to just really, you in preparing for this webinar, you told this great story of what that actually means, from the standpoint of IntelliCare. Can you please, take us through it?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, look, the chart's spot on. I'd say 1, 2, and 4 here. The whole thing is straightforward, but straightforward doesn't necessarily mean easy, right? 1, 2, and 4 are very much in the control of the organization. That number 3, collecting, introduces a third party, and that's where I think a lot of the complexity and challenge comes in. And so the anecdote that you're referring to that I shared with you is, so I told you a little bit about our business at the outset. The way the cash piece of our revenue cycle works is when facilities contract with nurses through us, we bill and pay nurses on a weekly basis. And so on the same day the bill goes out to the facilities for the hours that they've contracted, we send the payment to the nurses for those hours worked. And so, you can tell from that the cash cycle on that is not great, and kind of the opposite of what you get with a SaaS business, where it's pay in advance and you get deferred revenue, and your revenue cycle becomes a source of cash for the business. Our revenue cycle is very much a use of cash for business. So we're fortunate in that we have, DSOs that are around 40 days, which for our industry is actually very, very good. But that means we have this 40-day cycle on when cash goes out the door before we collect it. And, early in the company's history, that 40 was actually something much higher. And when you think about what all companies prioritize, but particularly young companies that are trying to make a place for themselves in the world, is growth, 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 growth. And this business found itself in the early days in a position where it was driving the growth. And so, that's great. What could you possibly be worried about? But because of this terrible cash cycle, was running out of money, because we were paying all these nurses, but not collecting quickly enough from all of the facilities. And so it created this perverse scenario where you're driving the rapid growth, which is what you want from a long-term value creation perspective, but you may not survive it unless you figure out a way to finance it or get better at it. And in this particular instance that I shared with VC, the company got so challenged with their cash flow that they actually made the decision, the only way that we can kind of save the business until we get more funding is to throttle the growth, because that would then reduce the amount of cash that was going out the door. And so the company intentionally throttled the growth to get by on cash until the next funding came in. And it's just a really interesting anecdote of challenges that smaller or earlier stage businesses can face, where you go through all this time and effort to drive the growth, but because you don't have a good grasp on the cash, you end up having to take this action, which is the complete antithesis of what you've been trying to drive in the business. Now, fortunately, this company survived that, learned a lot from it. It actually forced a lot of actions that I think we'll talk about later in terms of how do we get better around the AR and revenue cash cycle. But I think just a really interesting story to highlight kind of how important it is to use tools to manage AR, to use processes, to use discipline, to be all over that cash cycle.
And to have visibility into your cash cycle as you go through that process, right? Because it's easy to get caught up in the efficiency metric, and not to say that the efficiency metric is not important. It is important. but to what end, I guess, is really all we're trying to highlight, right?
Yeah.
In the end,
Yep.
it's about like, why do you want to collect faster so that you can have more working capital to fund the business, either to meet the operational needs on an everyday basis, or to, in your case, as you said, to grow the business more effectively.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is also that even, at some level, you're funding a 40-day DSO, and the DSO increases, it gets worse. Even with a 40-day DSO, if your growth gets higher, it gets worse, right?
Totally. Right. I mean,
So,
you think about everything you've said thus far is germane in any environment, but you think about the environment we're in with rising interest rates. And so capital is getting more and more expensive. And so when you think about the kind of cost of capital, your own internal operations is by far the cheapest, right? So being able to generate more capital from your own operations by driving the DSOs down is far preferable than drawing on your AR line or raising equity or the like. And so, those tools and those sources of capital are important, and there's a role for them. But you're potentially incurring significant costs in your business if you're foregoing the opportunity to make improvements on the core cash cycle.
which brings me to the proverbial, here's our first poll question. So I do want to, get people's perspective. And to some extent, it may be unfair because we've led the witness all the way here. But, we would certainly love to get your thoughts on what aspect of AR, as we've discussed it here, would you value the most, right? And I got to figure out how to do this. So let me start the poll, I guess. And so we'll just take a minute, if you don't mind just answering these two questions, right? One, which is, we just want to understand what kind of business you have. And so please go ahead and answer the first question about which accounting system you use. And the second is these four things, right? Predicting payment delays, improving collections efficiency, boosting working capital, shorten days sales outstanding. What is the sort of most important element of your business? And Chris, obviously, I think I know where you come from, but, hold your answer, but, would love to know where you stand as well. I'll just give it another second, and then we'll get started on the other element of it. Going once, going twice. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to end the poll, and I guess there's some way to share the results here. And here's, are you seeing my screen? I don't know. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we can see it. Yep, we can see it.
Yep. So, so it looks like, improving collections efficiency, boosting cash flow and working capital as expected, right? I mean, these are the outcomes that I think anybody really cares about. And it sort of is
Scroll down,
consistent.
BC. We can only see the top question. We can only see the top question. Scroll down.
Scroll down was just really what accounting system it was.
That's all we can see is which accounting system it is.
There are two questions only. What was the accounting system and what were the benefits?
Okay. I'm only seeing the answer to the accounting system one.
Oh,
but
okay.
That answer might be on your screen, Chris. I think it came
okay.
up for me too.
Sorry, I hit close. My bad.
But no matter, right? I mean, I think that, it's what we thought it would be. But let's move on, right? Because I think that, it sort of summarizes what you just said, which is the most painful part of doing this and the most valuable part of doing this is actually collecting payments because it has an impact on cash. The second thing that I wanted to do was to just really segue into another example of what an impact it has with some specific numbers. It's a little bit of an anonymized case study, to tell you the truth. And so, but the backdrop is that this is one of our customers, and it is a company that is a software company selling software to large manufacturers. Revenue in the $8 to $10 million revenue range, about 60 people. And late last year, it's a seasonal business. And late last year, most of their collections take place in new contracts are closed in fourth quarter. Much of their collections take place through the rest of the year. And what they found was that a lot of the, new contracts that they had, they were sort of having trouble collecting on, and their growth was making the problem worse, very similar to what you just said. So we worked with them, and please bear with me while I take you through this. We worked with them to implement the Centime accounts receivable module. And one of the things that they did in the accounts receivable module, which I will subsequently ask Griff to walk us through, is to automate email reminders to their customers. So in other words, they would send invoices out, and then, without doing anything else, the only recourse that they typically sort of fell back on was to follow up with customers after the invoices were past due. So with Centime, what they did was they implemented proactive reminders to customers before the due date. And so the point I'm making is that, right around the sort of, December of last year, you can see their payments past due were running at about 60 to 65 days. Their collections efficiency was around in the single digits. They actually implemented a manual process. That's really what happened over here. They hired somebody to manually follow up, and you can see it did have an impact. Their days past due went down meaningfully. Their collections efficiency went up. But at this point, they also realized that this sort of manual collections process that they had was not going to scale as the business grew. So, between kind of, August, September of last year and November, they contacted us, we implemented the solution. And in September of last year, they started to put more and more customers, which is what the yellow line is, on these automated reminders. And you can see the impact, right? I mean, you can see how dramatically their days past due dropped. It's sort of, on average, it runs about 7 days past due. And their collections efficiency is right up around 80% or so. Very simple story around how something, while you want to do much more with AR automation, just the idea of focusing on the one thing that you have the least control over, collections, can have such a massive impact. And in this case, that impact was, about $900,000 in working capital in 1 quarter. For a company, you can see what the revenue was, but for a company with, about, $8 million in revenue, about $2.3 million in annual working capital benefit was, very, very meaningful. Their collections effectiveness, was through the roof, reduced past days by 76%, but perhaps more importantly, also the real intangible of saying that I can now grow the business without having to worry about my collections being a manual process. Make sense? Any thoughts, feedback, Chris, on what you see here? I know that you are also in a place where you have implemented automated collections and automated processes around AR. Does this make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and I'm not surprised, right? It's, we talk about the challenges in collecting, but things like automated alerts and monitoring. So what we've done is we've kind of quote unquote productized it such that we're a little larger, so we have an internal AR team, and so that they get alerts, and so that we can lock people out of the system when they hit certain past due thresholds that we assign and the like. And so it's the tools and techniques aren't anything crazy or novel, but it's just having the right tool set to make sure that it's deployed consistently and you have the visibility and are on top of it is the name of the game here, right? And so not surprised to see this improvement, this dramatic improvement as soon as they implemented and started taking advantage of some of the benefits of the application.
Yeah, if there's a theme that I'd like to keep returning to, it is that AR is important. Automating AR is really important, but AR is just but one component of the overall cash control lifecycle. And I'd like to kind of just really make this point, right? That while AR systems need to work within the context of your accounting system and your financial institution, and it's really focused on shortening DSOs so that you can put more cash on your balance sheet. The flip side of it is also very meaningful that automating accounts payable has the equivalent opposite accretive effect of lengthening DPOs so that similarly you can put more cash on your balance sheet. But both AR and AP solutions, we have this perspective that AR and AP solutions can really benefit, from a complementary cash forecasting capability, which then allows you to then say, okay, well, I've got a collections problem. Which collections am I going to focus on? Or I have a forecast that tells me what I need to do, from an AP and AR perspective. So, I think that, AR, AP, and cash forecasting all kind of really play into each other. It's not necessary that everybody has an AR problem or everybody has an AP problem, or you actually have a cash forecasting problem. But these are, elements that all seem to fit together and work together. And sometimes it's the case that, you might have no choice, but to actually go get some additional credit. Right. Again, I don't think that you needed to do this, Chris, if it turned out that, you were credit or capital, generally speaking, right? I mean, if it turned out that, you needed to you didn't want to slow down your growth, but you wanted to sort of continue to grow the way you were growing, there's no choice but to go out and get some credit that you would fund the 40-day DSO that you had.
Yeah. Yeah.
And many businesses are in this situation, right? If it turns out that, you can shorten your DSO, lengthen your DPO, maybe that solves the problem. But it might also be that, you need to have some access to some working capital for a relatively short period of time so that you can tide over what you need. And then, of course, how are you doing? How are my DSOs progressing from quarter to quarter? Are my DSOs shortening? My DPOs lengthening? How much burn do I have? Basic stuff, around how you manage cash. So I just wanted to provide all of that as perspective, and obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but also indicate that this is part of what we do at Santeam. We're excited about helping businesses, maybe just start in one place. Maybe all you care about is, automating your accounts receivable so that you can make your team more effective and, put more cash in your balance sheet. But it may also be that you start with accounts payable and achieve the same effect. So it's kind of, Santeam is all those things. It's a collection of really comprehensive, best-in-class applications that, taken together, can have and will have a massive impact on your cash, and that's what we've spent the last 3 years or so doing. And I'd like to just really turn it over to you, Griff. I know if you're all able to hang on for another 10 minutes or so, I am going to request Griff to walk us through some of the key components of our product. So Griff, if you don't mind, maybe an abbreviated version of what I asked you to do. I know that we ran a little bit longer than what I thought. So can I give you 10 minutes to just hit the highlights on each of the modules, AR, AP, cash forecasting?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks. I'll stop sharing and you can.
Perfect. And I believe we do have it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
I think you can share, right?
When I try, I'm getting the host disabled participant. If there's 3 dots next to my name, you try to make me the host or something.
I will try to do that. Okay. Go ahead.
Perfect. And I believe there is a Q&A section in here as well. So as I'm going through everything, again, it's going to be pretty quick. So feel free to jot down any questions in there, and we can either follow, if we don't have enough time, we can follow up on the answers or address them at the end. So don't hold back. I know it's tough to think of all questions in real time and hang on to them for the end. So just fire them off. And I think the best spot to start here, just given the conversation that we just had, is going to be around the accounts receivable side of the house. As BC mentioned, Santeam is a solution addressing all areas related to improving and managing your company's cash flow. And obviously, as we just learned, accounts receivable is a huge component of that, and ensuring that your invoices are being paid timely as well as predictably, and with the ultimate visibility and effort that we can possibly gain. So when we think of our accounts receivable management, it kind of comes down to 3 pillars. The first being visibility and insights, second being automation, and third being payments and the customer experience. So starting with the first being visibility and insights, having one system that ties together all information that typically lives in your ERP, your Excel, your sticky notes, your inbox, kind of all over the place, no real central house for it with respect to communication between customer, any notes on accounts, exactly who owes us what we've done to collect both on the invoice and the customer level, as well as expected payment dates, as we're going to bring in historical data as well to understand how your customers have paid you over the course of your relationship through machine learning and AI, and help you project when payments will be made based on their historical performance. So obviously we're not going to get into every little nitty-gritty detail here in the product. But the second element or second component there is going to be automation, which is going to be where your team can build out different automated campaigns in Centime and assign your different kind of groups and buckets of customers to whatever campaign makes the most sense. Obviously, customers aren't a one-size-fits-all approach, where maybe we have our smaller SMB customers that we don't have the best relationship with. They typically pay us, not on the best schedule, where we might need to be more proactive with them and put them on one campaign, such as the slow payers here, that, is going to be sending them, 2 reminders before the due date, 1 on the due date, and 3 reminders after the due date. So a much more proactive approach compared to maybe our larger enterprise customers who we have a good relationship with and only need, 2 or 3 touch points throughout the process. These automated emails as well are fully configurable in terms of the messaging, how you want these communications to read from the customer's perspective, ultimately just tailoring your approach and making it as personalized, streamlined, and scalable as you possibly can. So as you add new customers, add new invoices, we have the systems in place to efficiently scale the business and not let any potential invoice slip through the cracks, knowing that all of them are going to be touched in your exact manner that you choose. And then the third and last pillar there is going to be the customer experience. So included in each of these emails, we can provide a link where your customer would simply be taken to an online experience where they're able to view their invoices and actually facilitate payments, which we would then go back and reconcile and push that payment and close out that invoice back in your ERP. So saving your team a ton of time, saving a lot of friction between the customer and the accounts receivable teams who might be processing payments, over the phone manually today. So a lot of time saving, and ultimately all of these components working together is what results in that drop of DSO like we saw in the case study, and that acceleration in collection speeds, as you're going to be able to focus on higher priority events, knowing every invoice is getting touched with a very customer-centric experience. And then the last piece of the AR puzzle is using your own company's data to help drive decision-making moving forward. So as we're back here on the home screen, if I jump into KPIs and quickly toggle down to the receivable KPIs, we have high-level company metrics here, but when I jump over to the customer level metrics, this is where I can determine, which customers of mine might have the greatest opportunity to accelerate my cash flow if I can improve their payment behavior by maybe 1 or 2 days. So maybe I take all my customers over a certain threshold from an impact percentage and put them all on a separate campaign that's going to be much more proactive, sending them many more reminders throughout the process. So just trying to use as much real-time data as we can to drive decision-making, and ultimately see, are the changes we're making working or not in the form of KPIs. And that's not just on the receivable side of the house. I just know that, that's what we have been talking about, but what BC had mentioned earlier as well as payables is more of a process that your team is in a little bit more control over in terms of, hey, the cash isn't going to leave our bank until we schedule and make that payment. We're not relying on anyone else to pay us. This is our decision, which is where data is a huge component of as well, and tying in that full cash flow picture. So our payable system here is ultimately designed to help you make the best decisions as it relates to who to pay, when to pay, and what method to pay, all taking into consideration your company's cash flow. So the full end-to-end journey in terms of vendor sending you a bill, we're able to capture that bill through an email scraping technology, upload that, route it for approval. Once we receive necessary approvals, we'll post that invoice back to your ERP or that bill back to your ERP as an invoice, and then take it on a payment journey and tying cash flow into the whole picture, making sure that you're paying the right invoices at the right time with the right payment methods, all as it relates to your company's cash flow, is the grand vision here, and making sure that you guys have what you need and you're making sure that you're making the best decisions possible. And where those both kind of blend together and get you the best roadmap possible in order to make these decisions is in the form of a cash flow forecast. So like I mentioned before, with that, machine learning and AI that we're bringing in, we're going to analyze prior trends and patterns too, to help make smart predictions as it relates to, what's my cash today is obviously very important, but what's that going to look like 6, 13 weeks from now, by using a number of different factors and components here to build ultimately what we're looking at here in the form of a cash flow forecast. And where everything works really well together is if I see, a particular week here, like March 4th, where I am only projected to bring in 19,000 and send out 90,000, maybe I want to jump in here and see where these payments going out are expected to go, and then jump into my payables module and maybe push a couple of them here to the following week, where I say I have more cash coming in to offset, so I don't have to incur such a dip down in my cash. So ultimately giving you the tools to, again, use the forecast as a map and adjust your different strategies directly, all within the same tool that is ultimately giving you the ability to control your cash, which is something that a lot of, people don't have the tools to simply do effectively today. And then also the ability to jump into any given individual inflow or outflow to model out what if scenarios in the form of the example of, hey, we're staffing up. Let me punch that into my forecast, see if it's something we can afford, see the position, the effect on my cash flow. So ultimately just trying to give you the tools to operate your business as smoothly as possible and avoid any bumps in the road, and make strategy changes as needed on the AR AP side of the house. So I know that was pretty quick there.
That was good.
Of the demo,
Thank you.
but
Yeah, Chris, I appreciate it. I mean, Griff, I appreciate that very much. You've been sort of watching and so forth. Chris, any feedback or thoughts? And also, of course, what we also want to see, if there's folks on the webinar have any questions for us, we'll be happy to answer them now. We'll also be happy to answer them later. If you want to drop us a note, or you want to rewatch this webinar, or share with your colleagues, do drop us a note. We'll be more than happy to tell you, how to access it, or get a demo from us in more detail. But Chris, back to you.
Yeah, no, the product looks great, right? I mean, it's intuitive, and I think it really arms folks with the right tools that they need. Again, there's a lot of different components that ultimately roll up into cash flow, and so more than half the battle is kind of having that visibility and being able to pull different levers. And so, I mean, this is clearly a dashboard that gives you visibility into those levers and the ability to kind of pull on them pretty dynamically and quickly. So I can see why your client in the case study was so successful so quickly.
Well, thanks a lot. Appreciate you joining. And, thanks again, Griff. And thank you all for hanging with us over the last 35 minutes or so, 40 minutes. Hopefully this was meaningful and interesting. And, do let us know if you're able to, or interested in sort of digging into this a little bit more. Thanks much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.